Good afternoon once again, and welcome back to the virtual Veteran Entrepreneur Training Symposium. Today is part 3 of our webinar series hosted by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. My name is Earl Morgan, NVSBC Program Director, and to our new attendees, thank you for joining us today. We'd like to send a special thanks to our 8 sponsors who made this webinar series possible. Again, thank you for doing this for us. Okay, the runtime for this webinar is about 1 hour and it's being recorded. If you have any questions on this webinar, please send them to scott.denniston@nvsbc.org. You can view the replay on the NVC website /vets20. During this webinar, if you have any questions, we will try to get to them on this webinar. If by any chance we miss your question or do not have time to answer it, we'll get the answers for you and post it on the virtual Vets20 webpage. And now introducing once again the Executive Director for the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, Mr. Scott Denniston.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Earl. Sarah, thank you for joining us. You know, our last 2 sessions have been with government leaders about pretty much policy issues, things at the 50,000-foot level. And one of the goals that we had with virtual Vets20 was to bring you a variety of speakers and topics. And part of that was going to be some of the quality speakers that we had that were going to be in San Antonio with us back in May. And we have one of those today. Sarah Reida has been with NVSBC almost since our beginning. She's a great person, great attorney, does a lot of work for us pro bono, represents a lot of our members. The thing that Sarah's going to talk about today, she's one of the nation's leading experts in the whole VetBiz verification program. She's actually written a common sense handbook on verification that a lot of folks have used to navigate the process. She also does government contract law and litigation before appeals boards and GAO, and most recently represented one of our members, Veterans for You, in sustaining a GAO protest against the Vets First program and the way the VA was operating. So we're really thrilled to have Sarah with us today. She's a great lady, super mom, and just an all-around good person. So Sarah, with that introduction, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. That was very nice, Scott. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really glad that we got to do this, even though San Antonio was canceled like everything else for this entire year. So I'm hoping that through this, we can give the members a good overview of what to expect with the VetBiz process. And more than that, to be able to give you something more than what you could find on the website, because I have run into a lot of issues with VetBiz verification, and hopefully this will enable you to escape some of the hair pulling that I've encountered before we found workarounds. So we'll go over what some of those are as we progress. So next slide, please. Let's just begin. So the topics that we're going to look at today are the eligibility criteria in order to be VetBiz verified as either a veteran-owned small business or a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, and some of the nuances as to what these require, especially the control requirements. We're also going to look at navigating the VIP system. And this is what I was referencing earlier in terms of finding your way around some of the technical glitches, because I've encountered a lot of them. And the issue with the CVE is sometimes these can't be addressed immediately. So as a veteran, it's really nice to know what you can do in order to not encounter a technical glitch. So I have a list of these that I'm going to help you try to avoid. The verification or re-verification process, what to expect with this. It's a 3-year process now. So although a lot of you have probably already gone through the process with the new changes, if you haven't, and even if you have, they're constantly implementing new updates. So it'll be, so I'll let you know what to expect with that. And I'm going to touch briefly on joint ventures. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but there are a few major items that I wanted to address on joint ventures. And then I also wanted to address how to process a change request and when you need to process a change request when your business has undergone some kind of a change that you need to report to the CVE or otherwise face the consequences upon a protest. So next slide, please. So the eligibility criteria, you're probably all familiar with these already, which is ownership and control. Now, ownership is pretty straightforward for the most part. You can get into trust issues and things like that, but for the most part, the veteran must unconditionally and directly own at least 51% of the firm. So that means that if it is, say, for example, a veteran has a firm and then that firm owns 51% of the VetBiz or the verified firm, the firm seeking verification, that's not going to cut it. The veteran has to directly own his percentage of the firm's ownership interest. And then control. Now, this is the one that is very nuanced and where people always run into eligibility issues. So for whatever reason, a lot of times you can manage to get around the issues by offering a reasonable explanation that the CVE accepts, because everything is fact-based at the CVE. Whether or not you meet the criteria depends on the explanation that you have to provide to the CVE with relation to any issue that they identify. So the important thing is just to be transparent, tell the CVE everything you think that they need to know while answering the question clearly and fully, and looking to the eligibility criteria, because it's the eligibility criteria and whether you can adequately hit on the different issues they identify that will get you verified. So pay attention to the question. So some of the things that they do look at are whether the veteran controls the management and daily business operations of a firm, including responsibility over long-term and daily operations. They also require the veteran to hold the highest office, and in general, the veteran has to have the ultimate say over all major decision-making. So for example, if you have bylaws or an operating agreement, it has to set forth how the veteran is the one that has the ultimate say-so or what's going to go with the company decision. There are some exceptions through the 2018 rule with extraordinary circumstances. So for example, if you're going to sell the company, sell equity interest, I think it's bankruptcy, insolvency, that is okay to require unanimous approval because of the extent to how it would impact the other members. But other than that, it has to be the veteran who has to say so. Next slide, please. Thank you, Earl. Now, what I'm addressing here is all in the regulation at 13 CFR 125.13. And what this regulation does is it sets forth presumptions that will apply if certain circumstances exist. So they'll say, we'll presume that the veteran doesn't control if, and then there's a list. And so what we're going to go through now are the list of presumptions. I think that I didn't address all of them with relation to the ones where it involves the non-veteran having a office location that's shared, and there are a few that relate to the non-veteran and his control over the company or his involvement with the company. But I'll address that a little bit in the catch-all, so just be aware that that exists. And we're addressing most of these, so take a look at the regulation to make sure that no other situations apply to yours. So control issue number one is the veteran who works remotely. And this says that if the veteran works away from or lives away from, I believe it's 150 miles. If you live more than 150 miles away from the job site or office locations, you're presumed not to control. And really all this means is that you have to have a system set up in your business to show that even if you can't be physically on site to some of the locations, it doesn't matter. So for example, I work with a lot of companies that provide transportation services. And if you provide transportation services, a lot of times those services are provided not where the company headquarters are. But just because you can't be physically on site doesn't mean that you're not controlling what's going on. There are ways that you can keep in touch, electronic mail, fax, you can have company meetings virtual. And as we're learning with COVID now, with everybody having to work to telework, we know that a lot of people can function without physically going into the office. So what you just need to do is have a brief explanation for why, even if you're remote, you're still able to control your company. And it's fact-based, and it just depends on, I just tried to change it myself. Next slide, please, Earl. It just depends on whether or not you can get them a reasonable explanation. Control issue number two is a veteran with outside employment. Now, what I'm going to talk about here are things that aren't in the regulations. It's things that I've been seeing from the CVE. If you're a veteran and you have outside employment, unless they've changed very, very recently, they have been requiring veterans to provide a letter from their outside employer saying that it is okay for them to be working for the veteran firm during their work hours with that outside employer. And as you can imagine, this is a non-starter for a lot of folks because other than relatives who own a company that you're also working for, a lot of employers aren't wanting to provide this particular letter. So just be aware of that when you're going in, that this is most likely still a requirement that might be a roadblock. If the operating hours of the business looking to be verified, and then the one that you're working on that as outside employment, if it's only an hour, they're not going to ask for the letter. But as I've been told, anything more than an hour, they'll ask for a letter saying it's okay for you to work during office hours, which I don't think most employers would want you to do. So again, problematic. And you need to be able to show flexibility with the outside employment to show that you can still work for your company, because the reality is that a lot of these firms being verified are startups. And so you don't need regular office hours. You can do things any hour as long as by midnight a client has something in their inbox and they have a deliverable. So even if you have a 9-to-5 job, in many situations it's found to be okay because you're able to show that it's at the end of the day, if your regular hours are during off hours and Saturdays and Sundays, and that works with the nature of the business, I've seen the CVE accept that on many occasions. It just depends on what kind of business you have and how reasonable your explanation is with how you've arranged your arrangements for business operations. Next slide, please. The second one is, or the third one, counting, is a non-veteran involved with firm is or was employer a veteran. And this has to do with leverage. So if you have a veteran who teams up with a former employer, especially if that former employer has taught him to do what he needs to do in order to open this new firm, that can be problematic. In a lot of instances, you have it as the uncle was the former employer, or somebody who was a trusted colleague and he mentored the veteran. There are plenty of reasonable explanations for why this is okay, and this isn't something that is nefarious that needs to be hidden from the CVE. A lot of times it can be perfectly fine, but they do look at this one with particular scrutiny because we've all heard the rent-a-vet stories. We've heard about people who just set up companies that they want to use the SCDOC status. And so if this is the situation, or if it's a situation that you have non-veterans involved with the firm, just make sure that you have a reasonable explanation for the dynamics of the relationship and how whatever that non-veteran is giving you isn't something that gives them leverage. So for example, if you have no working capital and the non-veteran is giving you all of your working capital and loans, it's going to be hard to get around that one, even if ultimately that non-veteran wouldn't be trying to use it as leverage. The fact is that they could control it, and that would be problematic. Next slide, please. I apologize. It's about 90 degrees in my house. I'm in Naperville, Illinois. I have a feeling that everyone is coming at us from all sorts of different places. Control issue number 4 is the veteran is not the highest compensated. I've come across this one a lot just because when you're a starting business, you need to recruit talent. And in order to be competitive, you have to be able to offer competitive rates. So if you have a situation where the veteran is not being paid the highest amount, you would need to come up with an explanation for why giving more money to another person is beneficial to the business. So if they work longer hours, if they are being paid to capture new business, or maybe they're working on a contract that is really important to the company, those would be explanations for why it is okay for the veteran to not be the highest compensated. And as we know, in a lot of situations, when you're getting your business off the ground, a lot of veterans elect to take lower salaries because they want the business to succeed, and so they put the business first. And keep in mind, too, that there is a verification assistance brief on this that says that when they're looking at whether the veteran is the highest compensated, they're looking at everything. Because if you're a veteran and you're owning the company, you're probably not a W-2 employee. You're probably just getting paid in distributions. And they're supposed to be looking at everything. So what you need to show is at the end of the day, at the end of the year, you're getting more income than anybody else, regardless of how that income comes in, if it's distributions or if it's a salary. Next slide, please. And then control issue number 5 is if a non-veteran holds a critical license. I've seen this come up basically every single time I'm looking to verify a firm that's professional and it's multidisciplinary, because the idea is that if it's architecture and engineering or surveying or whatever else, the veteran isn't going to have all of the licenses because, as the saying goes, jack of all trades, master of none. So the veteran most typically has just one license and then has knowledge in the other fields. And so they are very, very, they look at this with a lot of scrutiny. So just make sure that when you are looking to verify a professional firm with several different fields, that the veteran is able to show that he has enough experience either overseeing the other categories or just understands how to monitor the use of those licenses. I mean, for example, I'm a lawyer, I have a professional, like a license in Virginia and Illinois. If I were to try to team up with a veteran and get a verified firm through my company, it wouldn't work, because if the veteran doesn't have a law degree, he wouldn't know what I'm doing if it's bad or not, because you would need actual legal training to do that. And so it would give me too much independence and ultimately be a control problem. So next slide, please. Control issue number 6 is if the non-veteran provides critical financial support. This is in vein of some of the other presumptions that is in the regulation. Basically, just be careful of what a non-veteran is bringing to the firm. Make sure that it makes sense for the company and for the dynamic of the arrangement, to where it doesn't give them any leverage over the firm, and that to the extent that it is value, you can show that you're either paying fair market value for it, or the way that it's arranged doesn't allow them to pull the rug out from the veteran and therefore not allow the veteran to really run his company. Because the idea is that if the veteran really, really needs the support, if the rug is pulled out from under them, they can't operate. And so they're basically going to let the non-veteran do what they want. So you just need to show that it makes sense based on the nature of the relationship, that the non-veteran is offering the support and that it's not a leverage issue. And control issue number 7, which I believe is the last one, is the cancel. They just have this in there just because they wanted to make sure they covered everything. If there are any business relationships that exist where the veteran is dependent on them, and if they were to exercise or decision-making that would not be to the other firms or the non-veterans liking, they would be in great financial risk or great economic risk, that they would find that this impedes control. So this is just their catch-all. And again, to just reiterate, it's all fact-based. So to the degree that you have any of these presumptions implicated in your own application, make sure that, number one, you're transparent in your explanation to the CVE, and also that you're able to provide a detailed and reasonable explanation that shows how you meet the eligibility criteria as enumerated. And again, it's 13 CFR 125.13, and it's laid out pretty well and comprehensively in the regulation. So now we're on to the second topic, which is, Earl? Oh, wait, other common control issues, just to cover these quickly. Veteran must be the highest ranked officer. Corporate agreement must provide the veteran ultimate decision-making power, with the exception for extraordinary actions. The further assurances clause is superfluous, and I'm not understanding why the CVE has been requiring it lately, but I've been seeing it being required, which basically says that in your operating agreement, you have to have some provision that says that the non-veteran, or actually any owner, will make sure that they do what is necessary to fulfill the obligations of the operating agreement. And I've just seen the CVE come back with, you need to put this in before we'll approve you. So just be aware of that. And then the right of first refusal is now okay if it's normal commercial practices. This is something that used to not be allowed with the VA. Actually, I think I'm getting it mixed up. I think it was the SBA it wasn't allowed, but the VA it was. Gosh, I can't believe it's been a few years, but anyway, across the board with all kinds of contracts, you're now allowed to have the right of first refusal if anyone wants to get rid of equity interest. This is okay now. So now we're on to the next topic, please. Thanks, Earl. So navigating the VIP system requires you to create a profile. So any person who is a business owner, and it doesn't matter if they're 59% or 9%, have to create a business profile. And they have to provide 1 year of tax returns, including all W-2s. And if you have a joint return, that includes your spouse's W-2s, a resume, and then there's a Form 877 that needs to be signed. And basically that just requires clicking a few times because the veteran owner will have already put your information into the system. And the way that you log in is creating a login via ID.me, which is for non-veterans. Or if you're a veteran, sometimes you will use ID.me if you don't already have veteran benefits and use DS Login, or you'll use DS Login. Those are the two options. Next one, please. And this is a screenshot of what you'll use. The one on the right, which is ID.me, just know when you create your account that they're going to ask you for some really personal financial information that will be very nuanced. For example, I think with mine, they asked me the amount of my car loan 6 years prior. And if you get them wrong, they'll require you to FaceTime with them and show them your passport and your social security card. I think those are the two documents. So it's a bit of a pain. So before you go and try to get an ID.me account, make sure that you know the answers to the questions, or you have access to things that you might need to look up. Next one, please. The next one is common technical issues. This is one of the topics I wanted to hit because, like I was saying, I've done a lot of these and I've run into the same glitches over and over again. Now, the first glitch is when you label your documents, make sure that they don't have any special characters in the title. Have it only be letters and numbers. Only letters and numbers, and they'll accept the upload. If it does have a letter or number, then it just says that you can't upload it. The other point is that you have to have all mandatory and owner documents uploaded before you submit. With the old system, it was kind of nice because as long as you had something, for anybody who's in the old system, you remember how it was one screen and it was a yellow dot by each document type. And then once you put something just in there, whatever it was, it would turn green. So even if you needed 3 years of tax returns, if you put 1 year of tax returns in there, it would turn green and you could submit as soon as everything was green, and then basically get yourself in the queue and then just wait for them to ask you for documents because you knew that they were going to ask you for documents anyway. But that's not the way that it works now. The way that it works now, and it actually ends up being a lot more streamlined on the end when the CVE is in the intake and the examination process, is you have to have every single document that is required added, and then you also have to have all the owner documents added. So each owner on their side has to have successfully logged in and uploaded their documents. And I actually don't have this on here, but I want to mention it because I see it every single time, which is when you are logging in as ID.me, I would say 90% of the time, you're not going to see the business that you are attached to. 90% of the time, you're going to log in, and on the right-hand side, it should say a business name, and then on the left-hand side, it should say, I think it's owner details is the tab name. If those are gone, it means that you just have to submit a help desk ticket and just say, my account isn't yet linked to the business. Here's the DUNS number. Can you just link me to the account? And if you see that, just don't even bother doing anything else. Just submit a help desk ticket because that's the solution. And you won't be able to do anything else. So, and then text box. So letters of explanation, you can no longer upload those directly in the initial submission. You have to wait until you get into the examination process and they're looking at your application. And so if you want to provide a little note, like for example, when I was mentioning the multidisciplinary firms, if you want to note, hey, just so you know, there are multiple licenses, give me a document request and we'll explain how I can control the license. We'll appreciate that because they'll understand that you're anticipating something that you need to explain, but there's no way for you to actually upload a letter. With some of the fields, like for example, leases, I've tried to do it before, and the way that it works, or licenses, just try to find somewhere to put it. The problem is that if you want to upload a document, they have you identify what the kind of document it is, and if you pick anything else, they have all this other fields you have to fill in that don't have anything to do with your letter of explanation, so it's just not even worth trying. And I believe that was everything, so we'll go with that. And then the verification and re-verification process is 3 stages of review. And you only need to do anything with the 2 stages of review. So intake, there are currently only 2 intake analysts with the CVE. It's Jessica and Courtney. So unless they've changed it very recently, it's Jessica and Courtney. And as soon as you get the notice that you've been assigned to a different person and it's no longer Jessica and Courtney, it means that you've passed the intake stage and you're in the examination stage. And so what they do in the intake stage is they take a look at the whole application and they make sure that it's complete and that there's nothing that you missed or something that needed to be updated or provided that wasn't there. Like, so for example, if you have a missing license or your lease was missing, they'd ask for that in the intake stage because they're just looking at it for completeness. And then the examination stage is when you're assigned to an actual examiner and they start looking at the eligibility issues. So they'll inquire, the first thing that they do is they ask you to sign a form saying that you've gotten all necessary licenses and to tell them the best number to reach you, the operating hours of the business, and then your working hours. And then after that, they'll dig into the more nuances of the eligibility issues. And from what I've seen lately, it's been pretty quick in terms of getting through the examination process. It doesn't matter if you're re-verification or if you are verification because you all go in the same queue. So even if you've been through before, it's not like there's a different pool. So just know that it takes about the same amount. And then with re-verification, the way that it works with the documents is when you log in, you're basically going to re-provide all of the different documents. So the process really is the same thing. I mean, you can have, like, so for example, if you were audited recently via an onsite examination, you could tell them everything's in the system. Just so you know, I'm not providing this. Here are the additional documents. But in my experience, I've seen them re-ask for those documents. So if you have them on board, you might as well just re-upload them again. It's really up to you. I mean, because sometimes they very well might not ask for them. It might just depend on the examiner, and if they have some glitches on their end where they can't see all of your documents. And then federal review is the quality check on the VA side. So that's when their quality checking what the examiner has done, and the examiner will have said, I think that they're okay, it's time to let them through, or here's the Prf Notice, which I'll discuss later. What do you think? And so then they quality check that on their side. So next slide, please. So the documents required, again, as mentioned, from each owner, regardless of ownership percentage, it's a resume, 1 year of personal tax returns, and then Form 877. And then from the business, that's the list of everything that they require. And I think I might have had this in a prior slide, but I skipped by it. Contracts are a huge pain to put in, because the way that they do it is you have to upload the contract, and then you have to fill in at least, I don't know, it's like 16 different fields of information about the contract. What I have done, and a lot of times the problem is that you can't even do that because some of the fields don't apply. Every single time I do one of these, I say, no, I don't have the document to provide. And then in the text box, I say, we do have these documents, but we're having difficulty inputting the information. Please request these in a document request. And they'll just ask for the 5 contracts in the document request, because to actually fill out those fields will take a tremendous amount of time, and you might have issues with it anyway. So it's cleaner to just tell them, hey, would you mind asking for this in a document request? And then everything else speaks for itself. Commercial lease, if it applies. If it doesn't, you would do in the text box. This is a home-based business. We don't have a commercial lease. Corporate documents for the LLC would be an operating agreement, and for a corporation, it would be bylaws. And then they'll want the certificate of formation, articles of organization. Basically, whatever the state auto-generates at the time that you formed your business, they'll want to see. So next slide, please. And then this is just an example of what one of these looks like. So you'll see on the left-hand side, they have a list of all of the different categories of documents. And then this is what the legal structure page says. And then all of the ones that are required, sorry, it's small on my screen, it says required. So any one that says required, if you don't put something in it, at the very end when you try to submit, it'll say you can't submit because you haven't uploaded all of your legal structure documents. And so you would just have to go back and see which one with the mandatory field has something missing in it. So next one. See, it's not so bad. It's really, really gotten a lot better. Tom McGrath, the director who was there until he departed recently, was really great. And I think that the CVE has really made an effort at improving. And I'm really curious to see what's going to happen when the SBA takes it over, if ever, because I've seen the recent rule where it says that they're going to do it, and it seems to give both entities an infinite amount of time to make the transition, which means that it might not happen. So the next stage is the results. So verification and re-verification. If you're approved, you're good for 3 years, and then you have to notify the CVE of any changes that might adversely affect eligibility. And I mean, honestly, the way that it works for me is that if it doesn't adversely affect, you shouldn't have to report anything. But they really do want to know about everything. So if you have a change, just go ahead and do a change request. Be transparent, have it be in the record that you did the right thing, and tell them about anything that happened that could affect eligibility, even if you are 100% sure that you're fine with whatever was changed. Post-review findings. This is when they have found that you're not eligible, but even though you're not eligible, they give you a do-over. So they might say, we found this problem with how your business is run. We think that the non-veteran is controlling it because they're offering X, Y, and Z. And then also your corporate documents have this provision that's a problem. They're giving you a chance to provide a better explanation that makes sense and passes muster, and to fix your corporate documents. And so a lot of it happens because of a lack of clarity in an application, or maybe a disconnect with the examiner. So just be very, very careful when you're responding to a PRF, because a lot of times you really can't overcome the problems, that it's just something that just requires a little bit of additional explanation. And so you have to elect to participate within 2 business days. And then after those 2 business days, you have 5 more business days to provide your explanation. And then if you do a good job, you get an approval letter, and that's the end of it. And if you don't do a good job, or it doesn't take care of everything, you'll get what's called a final PRF notice, and basically that just tells you you have to withdraw. You can accept the determination letter, which basically means that you would accept a denial and then wait for 6 months, but there's literally no incentive whatsoever to doing that. So if you take that bite of the apple and it doesn't work out, you basically are faced with withdrawing. And that's a big improvement over the prior system, where the prior system was, if you got denied or you're doing a request for reconsideration, you're just waiting and waiting and waiting for that 6-month period to expire. And the way that it's set up now is they give veterans a lot of different opportunities to fix problems in order to get verified. And that is really beneficial, because the reality is that no one's really trying, well, I'm sure some people are trying to game the system, but the vast majority, everyone's just trying to get verified and do what they need in order to be eligible. And it didn't make sense, as they were doing it before, to just up a denial on an application. But most of the time, if they just asked a few clarification questions, let a veteran fix just some technical problem with their operating agreement that had no bearing on how they did business anyway, you could be verified and you were eligible, and everyone had the benefit. You could compete for VA contracts, and then they had more folks in their competitive pool. So it's a really good thing that they're doing it the way that they are now. Next one, please. And then joint ventures, I'm going to touch on really briefly, just because everyone has been pretty joint venture happy lately. It seems like there are a lot of folks who are teaming up on different opportunities. And so the CVE has seen more joint ventures recently than it ever has. And the reason why joint ventures are so popular is because it allows you to get, in a lot of situations, solicitations will say that they'll look at past performance of both of the venturers. You can team up in terms of dividing the responsibility, and it just makes you more competitive in going after particular solicitations. But the kicker is that you need an agreement that is airtight. And the way that it works with joint ventures is you have to look at 13 CFR 125.18. That is your blueprint, because you have to have every single one of those provisions in your joint venture agreement, or you're not eligible. So if somebody protests you, you're done. And even though the CVE will be processing a VetBiz application for a joint venture, if you just have a joint venture agreement for a non-VA contract and it's not verified, and then you end up being protested, it might be taken away because it hasn't been vetted through the CVE and you haven't had your attention called to some of these provisions. So just be very, very careful that all these provisions are in there. And these are just some of these. These are examples. Now, on the next slide is where you see most sustained protests, which is the division of responsibility and the percentage of work. There are a few different provisions in 13 CFR 125.18 that talk about the division of what each party is doing. You have to line that up in your joint venture agreement. The big kicker is that you have to show how the SPVOSC is able to meet the percentage of work requirements, which is the 40% rule. And you need to be able to show that, because if somebody protests you on some other ground, even if it's some other ground that doesn't make any sense, if they look at it, part of that is that they're going to look at the joint venture agreement. And if the joint venture agreement doesn't lay that out, you lose, even though whoever protested you on something else entirely. So it's just important to be very, very careful, and to know that when you joint venture, the SPVOSC has to have, it has to be laid out how they're doing 40% of the work. Now, next slide. I'm not exactly sure where that's seeing the screen ahead of time. So just as another point of note on that is that with the percentage of work requirements, a lot of that requires being detailed, and it applies to each solicitation. But the way that the CVE processes it is when you're a joint venture going through the process, you're going to have a general joint venture agreement. And that general joint venture agreement is going to say, here's what we anticipate we'll do, and then this is going to be, at that point in time, it will be a contract that is characterized as not an IDIQ, but it's uncertain in nature in terms of what each party will have to do. So you're not going to be able to lay out in detail what each party is doing. So even though you get approved through VetBiz, every time you go after a solicitation, you're going to have to execute an addendum to that joint venture agreement that shows what you're doing with respect to that particular solicitation in terms of the division of contract responsibilities and then the division of the work to show the 40%. And it has to be filled out with specificity. Execute it before you place your offer on each solicitation, because you can't fix it after. It has to be before bids are due, or otherwise you'll get in trouble, because just being CVE verified isn't enough. You have to make sure you're CVE verified and then you've executed what you needed to do before contract performance, or before bids are due. Always before bids are due. Anything post-dated, you're done. So unanimity, I'm bringing this one up because I've gotten guidance from the CVE, and perhaps I didn't misunderstood at the time, but I thought that after talking with someone, they said something about how unanimity was okay with the members. Like if you have a management committee between the managing partner and the non-vet managing partner, that is not okay. Make sure that when you are drafting an agreement for a joint venture agreement, you don't have provisions like the ones that were in the case that's cited here. So if you're going to have a management committee, you have to make sure that the veteran company is in the driver's seat, and that ultimately any decision making is with the veteran company. So it's the same thing as when you have an operating agreement with a non-veteran and a veteran, where you make sure that the veteran has control. You just basically insert the companies there. The SCVOSB has to have control, ultimate authority and control. The way I deal with it in a lot of agreements is to say, look, the veteran has control, but we're going to have you on an advisory basis. Anything that's a big deal, we will be discussing, because when it really comes down to it, this decision kind of bothers me, because when I look at it, the decisions that they put in there are things that they would probably have wanted to agree on anyway. So they got booted for something that was technical, because in the end, when it actually comes to doing your business, if you have somebody who is your joint venturer, you're not going to go and enter into a contract without them saying that it's okay. So basically just make sure that you figure out what you want to do in terms of your relationship with your joint venture partner, and then calibrate it to make sure, however necessary, to make sure that it meets the VA requirements. Because this one, this is a technicality decision from what I can tell with this, because like I said, in the end, they would want everyone on board for these decisions. So there was no need to say that it had to be unanimous. They could have just said the veteran company has ultimate control, and then even though that is true, both companies would have been agreeing with all these major decisions. So that's unfortunate. So the next one. Mentor Proteges. This is worth noting just because to let you know, so the SBA has the all small mentor protege program. And the way that it works for people for companies that want to joint venture is that if you are the mentor and you're large, that doesn't matter if you're trying to be VetBiz verified. As long as the protege is small, that's fine. Whatever NAICS codes and where the protege is small, that's enough for them to be included in the VetBiz registry, as long as you're in that mentor protege relationship. If you're not in a mentor-protege relationship, each entity has to be small. If, say, for example, you have an SCVOSB and a non-SCVOSB, even if the SCVOSB is small, they're going to look at the revenues of the two different companies, and wherever the other venturer isn't small, they'll make you take off those NAICS codes. The only exception is the mentor-protege relationship, where it doesn't matter. You can just completely rely on the size of the protege, which would also be the SCVOSB. That's just really the only point of note I wanted to say with the mentor protege. That's the main benefit, is that you can have a mentor that is large. But again, the struggle is if you get a contract, making sure that it's not the mentor who's doing too much work. As the small entity, the SCVOC, you have to be doing 40% of the work. Next one, please. Change request. This is a technical issue that I've seen, and it's really not that much of a hassle once you know how to do it. This basically is the requirement where if you have any eligibility, or it's not even an eligibility issue, but if you have any changes that you've undergone that are substantive, the CVE wants to know about them. So you have the requirement to tell CVE about them within 30 days, and that includes ownership. From what I recollect, I think it used to be 60 days for ownership, and now it's 30. And I've seen a lot of folks who will choose to just go through re-verification and then report changes at that time. But the reality is that if you get protested and you have a change that you didn't report to the CDE, that could be enough to make you lose your status. So just be transparent and just do the change request. If it's not a big deal, it's not going to be a big deal to process either, because what's going to happen is you're going to tell them about it and they might not even care. They might not even ask for any documentation. They might just say, okay, thanks for letting us know, and not follow up with an actual document request. They will if it's something substantive, of course. For example, an ownership change. If you report an ownership change, they'll make you redo all of your 877s and the owner information. So for example, if you have a corporation, they'll ask for updated bylaws, any meeting minutes that show the ownership change, updated stock certificates, and updated stock ledger. And the reality is that you should have all of those anyway, so them asking for that shouldn't be that much effort, but at the same time it is. So it's something that might be a pain to keep track of. But just remember, if there's an ownership change, in particular an ownership change, always make sure that it's promptly reported to the CDE. And you would go to your account, and on the right-hand side underneath the business name, it would say change request, and you just hit change request, and then you would follow the prompts. And on the next page, I'll show you some examples of what you don't have to report. These are things that do not need reporting. So if any of these change, you don't have to bother with it. And then the next page are ones that do need to be reported. And those include legal structure, ownership name change, ownership change. The one big one that's a good one is VOSC to SCVOC. So for example, if you have a veteran who ends up getting their disability rating, then you would add the reason and it would become an SCVOC. And I've done this one before, and literally all they ask you for is for your determination letter from the VA, the rating decision. So it just depends on what the ownership, or on what the change is. Depending on what the change is, they'll figure out what they want to ask for. And then they'll give you, I believe they give you another approval letter, but it does not extend your verification time. So even if it's something more difficult and they put you through the ringer, it's not going to change your verification time. Is there another one? Okay, just stay vigilant. I mentioned this before. Just make sure that you identify business changes that can affect eligibility. So for example, if you change business locations, or if you take on another partner, if somebody gets promoted from, one I see a lot is if the veteran is CEO and the non-veteran is president, you'd want to change, you'd want to tell them that, because you want to have your corporate documents be very clear. CEO is still the highest rank, but we're going to make this guy president, and here's why his duties still fall under mine. And then just report changes when necessary, and when in doubt, just be transparent. For the most part, they are pretty easy, because the CDE only cares about certain ones, like the ownership change is the big one. And then respond to CDE correspondence to make sure that you don't accidentally end up losing your verified status because they haven't gotten a response in time. So next slide. Oh, any questions? And I just want to say, before we do have questions, is that I have my NVSBC. I have a clock and 2 different plaques. So I really am sorry that we couldn't do an on-site presentation in San Antonio this year, but I'm really glad to be here with you virtually. So thank you very much for having me, Scott and Earl.
Sarah, thank you for joining us. It was kind of like drinking from a fire hose with all the information that you provided. Hey,
I'm sorry, Scott.
just one question. I know in the beginning there was a big issue with VA checking all possible public information, whether it was licenses with the state, your website, tax returns, and what they were looking for were inconsistencies, where you had one guy or gal who would be identified as the CEO or the president, or that have different titles, or they had different mission statements. Do they still do that as much as they used to?
I think that they do. I mean, I've gotten some kind of weird questions. Like I had one where it was a commercial building that they were renting, and it was obvious. Like if you went on Google Maps, it was clearly a 5-story building where we had a number of office locations, and we got a request saying, "What is your affiliation with?" And then it named like 30 businesses, and because they were the ones that were found in the commercial building. But I haven't had any really strange questions in a while relating to that. But I do think that they definitely do troll the internet still to make sure that everything lines up.
Yeah, so the point there is make sure, before you submit to the VA, that anything that you can find in the public domain, that it's all consistent with your application, because I know that used to frustrate an awful lot of people.
And another good point to that is that, especially with the ones that are like Army or just not VA, a lot of folks, there was one that I was looking at where they had issues with what was available on social media, and it was just outdated. And so somebody protested, and then even though that, you know, there wasn't anything to that, once they looked at, I think it was a joint venture agreement or corporate document, it was the corporate document that stumped them. So it's like, if people want to protest you, that's another good point, is make sure that what they're going to find about you on the internet isn't going to raise a red flag. So you don't have to deal with a protest that either could be frivolous or could be sustained because they find something else.
Okay, good. Okay, well, we have not received any questions from anybody on the audience, so it's one of two reasons. One, it was drinking from a fire hose, or two, it was that you were just so spectacular that you answered all the questions that people had.
Well, I will say that the handbook covers a lot of this, and it covers all the other nuanced issues like trust, and I guess community property just isn't an issue anymore. But if you have any detailed questions, the handbook does cover a lot of it. And then if you need to email me with a specific question that you might think of later, just I'm always up for questions. I know it was a lot of information. I tried to pick the topics so they had as much practical information as possible, like the technical problems, because that is frustrating with the ID&E problem, like never ever having the business listed on your profile. So I thought that those 5 topics were pretty much hitting on where people would have the most questions. So if there's anything that's a follow-up, feel free to check in with me.
All right, thank you. I will. I think you hit a home run today, and we sincerely appreciate that.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Good, thank you. And Earl, who do we have on for next week's program as a speaker?
We have, I don't want to screw up her name, but we have, it's Maria Pantalci. I'm sorry. It's how not to protest bids next week.
Okay, very good. Good. So we hope that everybody that was with us today will join next week and in the continuing weeks. We're getting a lot of really positive comments about the webinars. So hats off to Earl for putting these on for us every week. Couldn't do it without our technical guy. And with that, we will sign off and wish everybody a good week. And if you're anywhere in the East Coast, or it sounds like the Midwest, stay cool.
Yeah, I hope that they fix our air conditioning soon. We have babies.
Yeah, I can imagine that's got to be tough.
Yeah, our basement's pretty cool though. We have movies. We can hang out in the basement. It'll be fine. First world problem for me.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, Sarah, again, thanks again. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. And any questions, again, feel free to email.
Great. Thanks.
All right,
Thanks, Earl.
thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care, everybody. See you next week.
You got it.